When it comes to comparing a video game to real life, there are very few which seem immediately more appropriate than Gran Turismo, and we've done so before. Gran Turismo 7 versus real life, Gran Turismo 6 versus real life, and now for this one, I'm turning my attention for the first time in the series to GT5, to see how this iconic game on the PS3 compares to the real world, at least for its time. And of course it doesn't get much more Gran Turismo than a Mitsubishi Evo on the Top Gear test track versus a real life car that I owned last year, a 2002 Evo 7 GTA in particular, one of the rarest Evos there is. It was only sold for one production year and it has a Tiptronic gearbox. If you're thinking, well, it's an automatic Evo, how good could it really be? Well, the car ultimately wasn't to my taste, but I will say slow it was not. You spool this thing up and it would do 0 to 60 in 5 seconds dead. In fact, I GPS verified mine at that time, and that was virtually stock. So very impressive numbers for a car with that kind of power, especially 20 years ago. As far as the game goes, well, it is of course featured in GT6 as well, but like I said, I want to give the 5th game some love for a change. So first of all, how does it stack up in terms of its representation? In terms of how it looks, how it sounds, the specs of course? Well, it's a mixed bag, and to be honest, a lot of this carries over to GT6 anyway. The specs, unsurprisingly for a Japanese car in particular within Gran Turismo, which tend to get the better treatment anyway, is pretty good. The horsepower, the torque, the weight, they're all about right. You can always pick things apart here and there, especially where Gran Turismo for some weird reason changes the horsepower of certain cars depending on what menu you're in, which has always been a weird thing, but the baseline is accurate enough to take it seriously. In terms of visuals, well, unfortunately this is one of those cars that was never given the premium treatment. Doesn't really surprise me, to be honest. It's not probably the highest on their agenda, but it looks good enough for its time. Of course, it's still using the Gran Turismo 4 model. It certainly looked very good at the time on the PS2. In GT5 and especially GT6, it's getting a bit long in the tooth, but as you can see, compared to the real life car, the biggest downside when it comes to the video is it just means I can't show you a decent interior shot of the car in the game because unfortunately it doesn't have one. In terms of the sound, I mean, it's fine, you know, it's Gran Turismo. They're not exactly known for their great car sounds. There are a few which sound good, the Shizetta, the 787B, but generally speaking a lot of the cars sound like hairdryers. Unfortunately, I have to say that's kind of realistic in this case, because the real world Evo that I had, even with a screamer downpipe, it doesn't actually sound that good. I'm not a fan of the way my Evo sounded, and it was actually one of the biggest things to me which let the car down compared to its look. So the fact that it doesn't sound great in the game is, for a change, not far off in real life. It didn't sound that great in real life either. Now though, we get to the interesting stuff. How does it feel compared to real life? And when I say this, I do need to clarify, I never expect these games to feel exactly like real life. As far as I'm concerned, unless you have some kind of next generation VR headset, a full rig, and a console that doesn't exist yet, we're never going to reach that. So what I mean by how does it feel is more so, does it capture the spirit of the car? And there are definitely occasions where different games, even older ones, have done a really good job of that. Test Drive Unlimited 2, for example, captures the Touareg V10 very well, and then Gran Turismo 7 more recently did a fantastic job with the BMW M2, and both of those episodes are here on the channel. As far as Gran Turismo, it's usually much more hit and miss. A lot of these older non-premium cars, they do tend to feel a bit more like boxes. You know, they don't sway around enough. They feel a little bit heavy, even when they shouldn't. On this occasion for me, I am going to say it's a mixed bag. On the one hand, it does have a lot of grip, as an Evo should. The problem is, it definitely doesn't capture the spirit of what is, to this day, easily the most impressive car I've ever owned in terms of cornering. To really experience how good an Evo 7 is through the corners, and I'm sure any Evo really, you have to be in one. And like I said, that's never going to be fully translated to a game, but Gran Turismo 5 actually does quite a bad job, to be honest, of showing off this car's ability. For one thing, the brakes are pretty bad. You have to brake so much earlier than you'd think, and the brakes are very vague. They don't have that much feel. The bigger problem though is the understeer. This car feels very heavy in the game, and if I recall correctly, I think it kind of does in GT6 as well, but we're focusing on 5 for the moment, so that doesn't really matter. The steering is way too heavy, especially under throttle. The car just pulls out toward the outside of the corner immediately, which is simply not an Evo thing. The Evo is known for its cornering, and it's known for being a fairly neutral car, when it comes to its cornering. Certainly in this era where they were much, much closer to being road-going WRC cars than something like an Evo 10 would ultimately become. To me, this one is similar in some ways, but definitely doesn't hit the mark of delivering what the Evo 7 actually feels like. If you were to make this more accurate, they should have made the car feel about 200 or 300 kilos lighter than it actually feels in the game. Not change the specs, but change the steering, the handling, the feel. The brakes definitely need to be more powerful in comparison to what they are, and ultimately the performance, although a little bit sluggish compared to what you might expect, it's not as explosive as you might presume an Evo would be. That part is actually quite accurate, because one of the disappointing things to me about my Evo was just how sluggish it was. And it's not just an automatic gearbox thing, it's because of that classic turbo lag, which is then added onto even more by the automatic box. Those two things put together, they kind of kill it. You really do have to spool up the car to get the best out of it, and if you're just driving under normal conditions and put your foot down, there is a lot of lag. The other stuff, in particular the handling, and unfortunately for some weird reason the braking as well, they're not quite there. This car does suffer, as strange as it is for a Japanese car, which usually you'd expect to have the best treatment in Gran Turismo. It feels kind of rushed together. I would presume that it's because it's the GTA and they didn't care as much, but even so, this is unfortunately one of those cars that ends up kind of feeling like a box. It doesn't really feel like it has any distinct personality, doesn't feel that special. It certainly doesn't feel really like an Evo at all. It could be anything if you just rebodied it using a mod or something. So yeah, it's a mixed bag. In terms of visuals, it's fine for its time. The specs are good. They certainly represent the car nicely, considering there aren't that many games that have the GTA to begin with, and it's very cool to see a car like this in a game. In fact, it's one of the reasons why I wanted to buy one myself in real life, as with many of the cars that I've owned. But ultimately, I'm going to have to give this one more so a middle of the pack. For me, it would be like a probably C rating for this game overall, at least when it comes to the representation of this car. Like I've said with other game versus real episodes, it even varies car to car within a game. It's not a blanket thing of, oh, Gran Turismo 5 is garbage compared to real life, or it's great. It doesn't work like that. I've played on games where certain cars feel great, and then others totally miss the mark, even as recently as GT7. On this particular occasion though, they didn't do as good of a job as I would have expected, especially, like I said, given that it is a JDM legend. That's it for my thoughts on GT5. Like I said, if you are new to the channel and you'd like to check out Test Drive, Forza, newer Gran Turismo games and how they compare on a car-by-car basis, and sometimes even bikes as well, then of course you can find those here on the channel. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.